July 26, 1833. London. The summer light cuts through the curtains in thin, pale strips. In a bed on the upper floor of a townhouse, a frail man of 74 lies still. His name is William Wilberforce, and in his hand he holds a letter. It has just arrived from Parliament. The Slavery Abolition Act has passed. He was 28 when he started this fight. He is 74 now. In between, there had been 46 years of speeches that changed nothing, votes that went the wrong way, and mornings when he must have wondered why he kept going. And now, finally, it's done. He presses it against his chest. He closes his eyes. 3 days later, he will be dead. But in those same hours, while Wilberforce lay in that room, letter pressed against his chest, eyes closed, Parliament was running a very different set of numbers. Not for the people being freed. Whose victory was it exactly? While Wilberforce lay in that room, the men who had fought him for 46 years were already making other plans. It wasn't just a way of life they were protecting. It was an industry. The sugar plantations of Jamaica and Barbados were among the most profitable enterprises in the British Empire. And the men who owned them, the West India planters, had spent decades making sure Parliament knew it. They didn't just lobby. They bought seats. Directly. In an era when certain parliamentary constituencies were essentially for sale, the plantation owners purchased enough of them to build a wall of resistance that held for nearly half a century. To them, a slave wasn't a moral question. A slave was a line item on a balance sheet. For 46 years, that wall held. Then, in the space of a decade, 3 things happened that brought it down. The first was economic. By the 1820s, the Caribbean sugar market was in decline. Brazilian and Cuban sugar was undercutting British plantations on global markets. The business was becoming less profitable. And as the money dried up, so did the planters' grip on Parliament. The second was a fire. Christmas night, 1831. Jamaica. A plantation in the hills above Montego Bay goes up in flames. Then another. Then another. What had begun as a work strike, 60,000 enslaved people refusing to return to the fields after the holiday, erupted into the largest slave rebellion in British Caribbean history. The man who organized it was a Baptist preacher named Samuel Sharp. He believed that the British king had already granted freedom and that the plantation owners were simply hiding it from their slaves. He was wrong about that. But he was right that the system could not hold. That the cost of maintaining it, the military force, the brutality, the constant threat of another revolt, was becoming more than the empire was willing to pay. The rebellion was crushed within 2 weeks. More than 300 people were executed, including Sharp himself. But the missionaries who had witnessed the suppression came back to London and stood before Parliament. They described in detail what they had seen: the floggings, the executions, the bodies left on public display as warnings. For the first time, ordinary British people heard what the plantations actually looked like. Public opinion shifted. Fast. The third thing was a reform bill. In 1832, Parliament passed the Great Reform Act, which abolished dozens of the so-called rotten boroughs, the bought constituencies the planters had used for decades to block abolition. Almost overnight, the plantation lobby lost its structural grip on the legislature. For the first time in 46 years, a majority of Parliament was ready to vote for abolition. The planters didn't fight it. They sat down at the negotiating table. Because they understood something that the abolitionists, in their moment of triumph, may not have fully grasped. The question was no longer whether slavery would end. The question was, on whose terms? 3 parties were in that room. The government needed a clean story, Britain doing the right thing, a moral victory they could point to for generations. They were willing to pay almost any price for that narrative, as long as the deal held together quietly. The planters wanted out on their own terms. Their industry was declining anyway. What they needed was to be compensated, and they intended to be paid well. To them, this wasn't a moral reckoning. It was a transaction. And the abolitionists? After 46 years, they wanted one thing: the bill to pass, whatever the terms. So a deal was struck. The enslaved people being freed, more than 800,000 human beings across the British Caribbean, received nothing. No land, no wages, no restitution for generations of unpaid labor. The plantation owners received £20 million. To put that number in context, it was 40% of the British government's entire annual budget. A sum so large the government had to borrow it from private banks to pay it out. And there was one more condition buried in the fine print. The newly freed people would not actually be free. Not yet. Under a clause the law called apprenticeship, they were required to continue working for their former owners, without pay, for up to 6 years. They had been told they were free. They were not free. So follow the money and see who's waiting at the other end. It wasn't a conspiracy. It was something worse. It was a system. When Parliament abolished slavery, it didn't simply declare that enslaved people were free. It framed the entire transaction as a property dispute. The law's official language described the compensation as payment for, and this is a direct quote from the legislation, the loss of services that slave owners would suffer upon emancipation. The loss of services. Not the liberation of human beings. The loss of services. That was the official language of a law that freed 800,000 people. In the eyes of the law, a slave was property. And when the state takes your property, it pays you for it. That was the logic. And once you accept that logic, everything that followed was perfectly rational. The more slaves you owned, the more you collected. The largest single payout went to a man named John Gladstone. 9 plantations, 2,508 enslaved people. In today's terms, he collected the equivalent of roughly £80 million. John Gladstone used that money, in part, to support the political career of his son. That son's name was William Gladstone. He would go on to become Prime Minister of Great Britain 4 times. And his first speech in Parliament, the very first words he spoke as a member of the House of Commons, was a defense of his father's plantation, an argument that the slaves there were well treated, that the accusations against the family were unfair. The son of the man who received the largest slavery compensation payout in British history became one of the most powerful politicians in Victorian England. That is not a conspiracy. That is how capital works. But £20 million was less than half of what the planters actually claimed their slaves were worth. The remaining gap, tens of millions of pounds, had to be covered somehow. It was covered by the enslaved people themselves, through the apprenticeship system. Up to 6 years of unpaid labor owed to their former owners after emancipation. They had no say in this arrangement. No one asked them. The gap between what the government paid and what the planters were owed was simply transferred onto the backs of the people being freed. They purchased their own freedom, at a price they never agreed to, with labor they were forced to provide. Slavery did not end in 1833. It was refinanced. Jamaica, 1835. 2 years after the act passed. A woman rises before dawn. The air is the same. The dark is the same. She pulls on the same clothes, picks up the same tool, walks the same path to the same field. Her hands know this work without being told. The cane doesn't know what year it is. The soil doesn't know what Parliament decided. And the hours, from first light to last, are exactly what they have always been. The only thing that has changed is the word the law uses to describe her. She is no longer a slave. She is an apprentice. On the same morning in London, John Gladstone receives the first dividend payment on railway stocks he purchased with his government compensation money. She doesn't know what John Gladstone is doing this morning. She has no way of knowing. History calls this year the year of emancipation. And all of it, every layer of it, was remembered under a single name: Wilberforce. The man who had pressed a letter to his chest and closed his eyes. The man who never knew what the deal actually contained. His name became the story, and the story became the cover. Because that is how systems survive. Not through villains, through heroes. Wilberforce was sincere. That is not in question. He fought for 46 years. He was threatened, mocked, and worn down to almost nothing, and he never stopped. And that sincerity, that absolute, unimpeachable sincerity, was the most useful thing the system ever had. Because when a good man's name is attached to a story, people stop asking what the story is covering. The bill passed. The name was remembered. The compensation structure, the apprenticeship clause, the borrowed money, all of it receded into the background. What remained was the narrative. Britain had done the right thing. Wilberforce had won. And the borrowed money, the £20 million paid to the plantation owners, quietly stayed on the books of the British government for a very long time. The people who worked in the factories, the people who paid taxes on their bread, their children and their children's children, all of them contributing year after year to a debt they knew nothing about. That debt was officially settled in 2015. Not 1833. 2015. The people who paid off the last of it were alive when the iPhone was invented. Some of them are still alive today. They didn't know they were paying it. They had no reason to ask. There was a good man's name on the story. Are we still paying someone's bill right now, without knowing it? And if we are, whose name is on that story?